Okay, perhaps let's get started. Thank you all for being here. This is a continuing series of seminars, virtual seminars, as part of the TRAC Translational AI Center, and this seminar is one in a monthly sequence of seminars organized by the AI Institute for Resilient Agriculture, and we are super excited to have Dr. Mark Ryan joining us to present, and he's going to be talking about the ethical and societal considerations for the development and use of agricultural robots. Mark is a digital ethics researcher at Wageningen Economic Research, and he focuses on areas involving robotics, AI, and digital developments and responsible innovations. He has a diverse array of publications involving thinking about ethics, especially digital ethics, in a variety of contexts like smart cities, self-driving cars, agricultural data analytics, and artificial intelligence. And this is particularly relevant for our work in both TRAC as well as the AI Institute, where the AI technologies, translational AI technologies that we are developing have to be adopted and used by the end user. And some of the things that Mark is going to talk about will help inform and help us think through this. So Mark, welcome, and we look forward to your talk. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Bhaskar. I'm just going to share my slides. Can you see the slides okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, thanks for the introduction, Bhaskar. My name is Dr. Mark Ryan, and I work in Wageningen Economic Research, which is one of the research institutes as part of Wageningen University and Research. So today, the topic I'll cover is the ethical and social impacts of AI in agriculture. And I want to just give a very brief overview of some of my publications in the area. So as Bhaskar said, my background is in ethics, broadly construed, but like in the past 7 or 8 years, I've focused on the topic of digital ethics, with everything from AI, self-driving vehicles, technology within smart cities, and so on. But really in the past few years, I've decided to focus or give more attention to the social and ethical impacts of technologies in the agricultural sector. This is partly because of the research institute that I belong to. And one of their main focuses is the agri-food sector. So these are just 4 publications that are relevant perhaps for some of your work in ERA, focusing on the digital, societal and ethical issues and impacts of using AI and technologies within the agri-food sector. So the focus of today's talk will be mainly on my most recent paper in AI and society, which is the social and ethical impacts of AI in agriculture, mapping the agricultural AI literature. So the aim of today's presentation is to provide you with a very brief overview of some of the main social and ethical impacts of AI in the agricultural sector. And I will do this through, or I did this through a thematic analysis of 11 overarching principles: transparency, justice and fairness, non-maleficence, responsibility, privacy, beneficence, freedom and autonomy, trust, dignity, sustainability, and solidarity. So I use these 11 principles to evaluate the contents of what has been published within the AI ethics literature, focusing on the agricultural sector. And I'll also contrast this literature with what has commonly been published within AI ethics guidelines. So these AI ethics guidelines, it's a combination of ethics guidelines from IEEE, the high-level expert group in Europe, and then there's a lot of ethics guidelines from the likes of Sony, Microsoft, Facebook. So it's a broad collection of what has been published within AI ethics guidelines. So yeah, basically it's a contrast to try to evaluate firstly what's been published in the context of AI ethics within the agri-food sector, but also how does this relate to what's been published within AI ethics guidelines in a more general sense. So what has been taken into account within the agri-food sector that's also been taken account in the AI ethics guidelines and vice versa. I'll also identify the impacts that are not being discussed within agricultural AI and which issues may be relevant and should be discussed, but which are being discussed within the AI ethics guidelines. So first of all, just a very, very quick general overview of ethics. So ethics evaluates what it means to live a good life, or it can mean how to live a good life and why we should even care about it to begin with. So essentially ethics means distinguishing between right and wrong and determining what we should do and how we should behave in certain circumstances and contexts. So some frameworks that have been used in relation to ethics would be, you might have heard of a few of them like virtue ethics, deontology, and utilitarianism. So virtue ethics focuses on this Aristotelian idea of what a virtuous person would do in a particular situation and how to aspire to become a more virtuous person. So it's more internalized ethics rather than externalized ethics. A second type of framework is deontology, which focuses on a distinctive set of ethical rules of what is right and wrong. So this is in contrast to utilitarianism, which focuses on what is the best outcome in a particular situation and for the most amount of people. So deontology would say, for example, lying is wrong. Lying is wrong in all circumstances and all cases, where utilitarianism states that, okay, maybe lying is okay if it saves an individual's life. So this paper will take a more pragmatic view approach to ethics and evaluate what are the most prevalent and significant issues within the fields, in the context of agriculture. So it won't really focus or use any of the frameworks. It'll take a more pragmatic, intuitive approach to what's being discussed within the field. So the methodology that I employed in the paper is that I used 11 thematic ethical principles, which were outlined in Jobin et al. Article. And these 11 principles, which I mentioned earlier in the talk, emerged from this paper and their content analysis of 84 AI ethics guidelines. So within their analysis of these 84 AI ethics guidelines, they derived these 11 overall thematic principles. So these 11 principles were used to frame the literature that was found on AI ethics in agriculture. So one issue that I found when I was trying to do a systematic review of what's been said in AI ethics in agriculture is that there's a severe limitation of publications covering this topic within the field. So I could only find 21 relevant articles on the topic of social and ethical impacts of AI within agriculture. So this is quite a limiting challenge, but it also offers a lot of opportunity for new and innovative thoughts and publications within this sector. So after I found these articles using the Prisma approach, I incorporated the Maxta 2020 data analytics software using both lexical searches and contextual analysis of the text using the 11 principles discussed earlier and also synonyms. So one of the more quantitative findings of my study was that it was very interesting to see from the very start how these 11 principles were discussed and mentioned within the 21 agricultural papers in comparison to the 84 AI ethics guidelines. So as you can see from the figure here, topic which was most discussed in the agricultural literature was the topic of sustainability. So this was often mentioned in the context of environmental, ecological sustainability, rather than necessarily focusing on other aspects of sustainability, such as economic and social. So what was first very apparent was that there was a greater predominance on topics around the environment, nature, preservation, ensuring respect for animals, that were found within the literature on AI ethics in agriculture, as opposed to the AI ethics guidelines, which topics of sustainability or the environment or nature were very minimally discussed, if at all. So I found it was a very interesting insight coming from an environmental ethics background. That there was a very anthropocentric approach within the AI ethics guidelines, as opposed to a more nature concentrated or nature focused approach within the agricultural literature on AI ethics. A few other interesting observations. There was a lot of correlation and similarities between the amount and quantity of things discussed. But as you can see, trust, which we discussed earlier a few times in a few of my talks with other people from ERA earlier in the day, that trust was a very significant factor within the agricultural sector. And this is another topic that I discovered in my own research with European farmers and also those who are working within the agricultural sector in Europe, that trust is a very predominant issue, and the level of mistrust between farmers and the government, farmers and regulators, and farmers and agribusinesses. So it took a much greater role within the AI ethics literature in agri-food than it did in the AI ethics guidelines. Some of the other aspects which were initially interesting was that there was a very low count for topics such as solidarity and dignity in both the AI ethics guidelines and also within the papers that I analyzed. So I'll just go through the 11 principles and how they were discussed within the literature on AI ethics in agriculture one by one. So in terms of sustainability, what came up in the literature was that AI must actually surpass current agricultural sustainability levels. So for AI to be usable and implementable, a lot of the literature said that AI should be more sustainable and more environmentally friendly than current agricultural practices. It must exceed sustainability quotas and measurements than what is currently being practiced in regular precision agriculture. Secondly, robots, sensors, and drones often hold the potential to leak fluid, toxic chemicals, emit fumes, and so forth on the farm, as well as cause issues such as surface water runoff, encroachment on habitats, or general pollution to the surrounding area. So while on the one hand, AI and robots may be able to potentially reduce the amount of pesticides that we use, the amount of chemicals deployed within the agricultural sector, robots themselves also should be considered as potential sources of pollution, and we need to try to minimize or ensure that they're environmentally safe and sound when being deployed on the farm. Another topic that came up was in relation to soil compaction from heavy machinery. So a lot of farmers worried about the issue of soil compaction and what would this do to the soil health when you will have large agricultural AI machinery on the farm. Another very interesting topic I thought that came up in the literature was this notion of genetic modification in order to accommodate robots. So one of the problems that is often being discussed is that robots aren't able to grip tomatoes or peppers in a way without damaging them, and similarly with some fruits. So this has been quite an issue in a more technical issue. One of the discussions involved in the literature was, well, should we genetically modify tomatoes and plants in order to be sturdier and more accommodating, that robots can retrieve these food sources rather than necessarily the other way around, i.e. making robots better and more sufficient at retrieving fruit and vegetables. So the second principle was in relation to non-maleficence. So non-maleficence essentially means do no harm, so avoid harm. So AI robots may reduce toxic chemicals and pesticides, thus protecting farmers from harmful health effects. So AI robots may have a very inherent benefit, and they may actually prevent the harm from toxic chemicals and pesticides for farmers when they're deployed. But on the other hand, AI may reduce accidents on the farm caused by human error. So this is one of the reasons that self-driving vehicles are being forwarded so much, that if self-driving vehicles reach levels 4 and 5, they'll be able to avoid accidents and avoid casualties on the road. So in a similar way, AI may be programmed and it may be implemented on the farm to reduce human error and human risk. However, there's also a risk of how AI robots may distress or harm livestock and wildlife on the farm. So this was a concern amongst farmers. How exactly will the AI robot interact with their livestock and also wildlife in the surrounding areas? Will they stress them? Will they physically harm them? How can we ensure that they're safe to deploy on the farm? And also, of course, there's also the concern that there's a vulnerability to hacking, sabotage, or spying. And thirdly, the third principle was in relation to trust. So building trust in agriculture is often challenging. I've found this in every aspect of my research in a European context, and I've also discussed it today, that it's also an recurring issue within agriculture in the United States as well. So AI may increase trust on one level. So if we can show and demonstrate proven ways to farm more efficiently, effectively, farmers may build up and increase the levels of trust in these new technologies. But also, on the other hand, AI may also increase distrust of agribusinesses. So there was the constant concern about what types of data would be retrieved when AI and sensors and robots are deployed on the farm, and what's being done with this data. Who has it? Who has access to it? Who's going to benefit from it? And will it be sold on to other companies? Will it be given to the governments to penalize them? How will this data be used? So trust was very commonly discussed within the ethics of agricultural data sharing, but for some reason it was less covered in my literature review on the ethics of agricultural AI. So I kept coming up against the issue of trust within the literature, within previous research projects, it was less covered in literature on AI ethics in agriculture. Fourthly, beneficence, which means it's basically converse to non-maleficence. So beneficence means to do good. So one of the concerns was who exactly benefits from agricultural AI. So this was one of the burning questions that was often uncovered in the literature. So one of the recommendations is that there should be a co-creating method with developers and farmers to ensure that they benefit from AI. And it is also important to identify the needs of the farmer before developing technologies that they will use. And farmers also felt that there is pressure on them to adopt AI technologies sometimes for the common good or the industry. So this topic came up in some of the research where farmers felt like if they didn't adopt AI, if they didn't adopt the latest digital technologies, they would be seen as backward or Luddites or laggards, and that they weren't necessarily forward thinking or advanced. So they sort of felt emotionally under pressure to integrate AI on the farms. Fifthly, in relation to freedom and autonomy, so this issue always comes up in the context of AI, generally speaking. So how can farmers retain control of their farms with AI? So some companies prohibit farmers from repairing or tampering with AI hardware. So a lot of you may be aware of the issues with John Deere when they purchase or use these agricultural AI hardware on the farm. Thus, this impacts their freedom. I heard earlier that there was a recent bill brought in to try to cover this issue, the right to repair bill. So I don't know much about it at the moment. I just heard about it a couple of hours ago from one of your colleagues. In addition to freedom and autonomy, farmers feel like they sometimes give over their control of the farm to AI decision making because it's seen as a more scientifically valid, more scientifically correct way of doing farming. And also sometimes there's a pressure to accept these decisions from the AI company or the AI software because of the high levels of cost that they've invested in this technology or the levels of risk that they foresee happening if they don't take the advice from the AI decision making. Sixthly, in relation to privacy, so what type of data is being retrieved and how will it be transferred, stored, used, and repurposed? In relation to trade-offs, so some farmers saw that trade-offs against privacy for the benefits and promises of using AI must be implemented. However, one study that I looked at, and this was a study that I believe this study was based in the US. I'm nearly sure it was a US study, but it stated that 78% of farmers were concerned about data sharing being sold on by the corporations that retrieve it. The context of justice and fairness, if AI is only deployed on rich, large monocultural farms, this may potentially seriously limit the uptake of AI by smaller farms, poorer farms, and also the global south. Carolyn, in his 2020 article, stated that because of the historically low numbers of women in STEM and farming, the increased integration of technologies and technologization of farming may further exacerbate the number of women in agriculture. So women are low represented like in a small level in STEM, but also in Western agriculture as well. So the increased incorporation of AI may actually make the situation worse, Carolyn states. Farmers also will not receive the benefits of AI. So there's a concern that the only one that will benefit from deployment of AI are large agribusinesses or agricultural technology providers. In relation to responsibility, so the likes of Pioneer and Santo require that their AI customers are also prior customers of their seeds. So in order to use AI developed by Pioneer and Santo, you have to basically buy into their seed repository and become a seed customer. John Deere also makes farmers sign licensing agreements that they will not sue the company if there is damage to their crops, land, profit, machines, or business as a result of their AI. So as you can see from these two examples, farmers are pushed and driven towards becoming more responsible and accountable for actions on their farm and the farm machinery and the decision making that this machinery makes. that may not necessarily be their fault if accidents occur, if crops are damaged and so forth. So while they have an onus of, while they're given greater levels of responsibility and accountability, a lot of this may be misgiven by the agribusinesses. In relation to transparency, there was a concern about the interpretability and understandability of the data being retrieved from AI systems, and if these recommendations are accurate. There needs to be a greater level of education, training, and understandability of AI within the agricultural sector in order to understand how AI works and its limitations. So it needs to be clear to the end user how to use the technology, what types of recommendations it will give, how accurate these recommendations will be, and also what are the levels of inaccuracies. So they have to understand how these technologies will work in practice and what are the potential outcomes and disadvantages of using them. Solidarity was only mentioned twice in the articles that I analyzed. The lack of solidarity referenced in the literature is possibly because AI in agriculture is relatively new, and the topic of solidarity is not a major theme that's often discussed in AI ethics literature. So it was only discussed a few times within the AI ethics guidelines that were analyzed by Jobin et al. So could AI and robots actually improve or harm solidarity within a community? So this is kind of an open question, and perhaps some people within the audience may be able to answer or provide your insights. So in some of my other research with roboticists around Europe, a general feeling was that in some countries it can improve solidarity, while in other countries it can actually harm and infringe upon solidarity. So the two examples I gave were Greece and Spain and Moroccan seasonal workers. So when we had the focus group with Greek participants, they stated that there was overall a level of solidarity and community amongst the introduction of agricultural robots because of the high abundance of people who work or have worked in the agricultural sector and a general understanding of the hard labor that's involved in it. So they were quite accommodating towards including and incorporating robots on the farm. However, in the example of Spain and Moroccan seasonal workers, so a lot of Moroccans travel to Spain for seasonal work on farms, and the Spanish roboticist that we spoke to said that one possible outcome of increasing robots on farms in Spain is that Moroccan seasonal workers' jobs may become redundant, and this could have potential tensions between the two countries because of a loss of income and a loss of benefits from Moroccan seasonal workers and the dependents that rely on this income and work. In relation to dignity, so dignity was not often widely discussed in the AI ethics literature, but it is in more so in other domains such as healthcare. So AI in agriculture does not have the same kind of dignity infringing potential as healthcare, I would say. For example, in healthcare, you're dealing with vulnerable patients, people with life-threatening diseases, people at end of life decision making. So there's a lot more issues and problematic concerns in the context of dignity. However, I would say that it is still a concern that AI and robots may potentially infringe on the farmer's role and their profession, thus impacting their dignity. So one issue that came up within the focus groups that I had before Christmas is that there's a fear or concern that farmers will essentially just become AI babysitters, just ensuring that they don't veer off path, ensuring that there's nothing in their way, rather than necessarily being farmers on their land. So the final two slides before we open the floor to the discussion. So overall, what arose within the AI ethics literature on agriculture, the 21 papers that I focused on, but was not a focus of the AI ethics guidelines were, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, this identification of the impact on other species, the environment and nature that has much greater significance and much greater role within the agricultural literature than it does within the general AI ethics guidelines. Also, in relation to animal welfare, did not come up at all in AI ethics guidelines, but was an important concern within the agricultural literature. Also, which I thought was very strange, when I was reviewing the AI ethics guidelines, there was very little reference to employment, despite this being one of the most important themes within AI, generally speaking, and especially within the agricultural sector as well. It's a topic that always keeps coming up. Whose jobs are they going to threaten? Will people have work? Will it replace humans on the farm, and so on? And finally, so conversely to this, what arose in the AI ethics guidelines, but did not appear in the agricultural AI ethics literature. So three of the main principles were transparency, dignity, and solidarity. So transparency was rarely discussed, despite it being a very important topic in most forms of technology use and the ethical analysis of these technologies. Dignity and solidarity did not arise much within the agricultural literature, although there are clear areas where these could be important for agricultural AI development in the present and in the future. So there's certainly room for more research on these topics, but they just were not covered in abundance within the literature. So that's everything I have to present today. Yeah, so if you want to get in touch, my email is mark.ryan@ver.nl, or my Twitter is markryanethics. So I'll stop sharing now.
Thanks, Mark. That was a fascinating deep dive into AI consideration, ethics considerations for us to think about. Open the floor for questions. If folks have questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or you can type it on the chat, and Mark and I can look at that. Yeah, while we wait for questions, can you talk a little bit more about this? How, what your take on how do we enhance trust for AI? Right? You had a couple of points about interpretability and education. So can you provide a little more of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is this is always nearly one of the first questions that gets asked on this topic. It's a burning question in the field and the debate. One of the main aspects I would focus on would be to ensure and demonstrate trustworthiness in order to build trust. So you can't just expect someone will trust the technologies, will trust the organizations or companies deploying them. You need to really demonstrate that you're a trustworthy organization. Your technology can be trusted, it can be relied upon, that it's not going to malfunction. Also, education is a big factor. So as well as demonstrating it, they need to be able to understand it and comprehend how it functions and how it functions correctly. And one of the topics that always keeps coming up is that farmers don't really care about like the technical details. They care about the end result. So they care about, will it increase profit? Will it increase my yields? And then conversely to this, will it cause harm on the farm? What type of issues do I need to identify? So I think it's a combination of demonstrating one's trustworthiness, either as a research organization or a technology developer, but also ensuring that they understand the issues that may arise, and just being more transparent with the end user.
Mark, sorry. I had a follow-up question. have you come across in your reading some good examples of how people have been able to build trust or do the education part well in terms of bringing farmers on board, for instance?
Sorry, I didn't catch it. You said in relation to, has there been any examples of?
Yeah, where the education or, that bringing farmers on board to a new technology has worked well. So it can be AI or it could be something else, but something you think has worked well.
I can't think of too many concrete examples offhand. Like I've read like a lot of just mentions and discussions of it in case studies. There was a few examples in the context of India where they were able to deploy agricultural decision-making technologies on smartphones, which was very cost effective. Like it was free, but it provided farmers with ways to keep track of their crop yields, keep track of their budgets and so forth. It was a more simplistic form of AI, but it enabled them greater freedom and greater free time to concentrate and focus on other aspects. So there's a lot of examples like this, but in terms of more technical and complicated forms of AI being deployed on the farm, because it's so innovative and there hasn't really been very much commercial deployment of AI robots. It's still a work in progress, I think.
Awesome.
Yeah, thanks.
George, you had a question, and then maybe Alan, and then Derek.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Hey, great talk, Mark. This is really interesting stuff. I have a question for you. Those of us who are doing technology development, kind of very early stage technology development for these kinds of applications, what kinds of things should we be thinking about, and what kinds of things should we be telling our students to think about on the ethical front? There's sort of a fuzzy, be aware and try to be a good citizen and know about these things. But is there anything concrete we can be advising people to make sure that downstream we don't run into these kinds of ethical problems?
Yeah, I would say just along the lines of you could first of all identify with the stakeholders and the end users of when you're developing technologies. So at a very early stage, have rounds of co-creation, have specific focus groups, and identify firstly what they want, what they need from a technology, what are some of the potential issues that they encounter in their current role, how can you help overcome these challenges. I heard a lot of these examples being given earlier in some of my talks with the ERA members, and it sounds like they're on the right track, and these would have been the same things I would have said in response to your question. So it's good to know that they're going in the right direction. But in terms of what should you say to your students and so forth, there's a lot of AI ethics guidelines and frameworks, like the IEEE one is a very renowned one for AI ethics. Also in the context, like the high level expert group has a EU trustworthy AI set of guidelines as well. So there's a lot of different frameworks and guidelines that they could use and implement in practice, just to see whether or not they're doing it accurately and correctly and ethically. Even within the high level expert groups set of ethics guidelines, they even have a checklist at the bottom of the document where you can very easily go, okay, this is okay, I have this covered. Privacy, won't be a concern because there's no transfer of data, blah, blah, blah. So they can easily brainstorm and identify what are some of the potential challenges and issues in practice, and whether or not they're meeting these requisites in their implementation of technologies.
Awesome. Alan, are you able to ask a question, or do you want me to read it out? If I don't get a response in one Mississippi.
Okay, I'm here. Yeah, hi. Let me turn on the video. Here I am. So, I just was wondering, you mentioned about the effect of AI on jobs, which is like a really big deal because, yeah, it's basically designed to replace all sorts of workers. And you said there was nothing about that in those 84 AI guidelines, but there was a lot in the literature. But isn't that the jobs basically the same thing as part about dignity and solidarity?
Yeah, what was interesting within the AI ethics guidelines, they more focused on dignity and solidarity within a societal context.
Okay.
So like, how will AI affect someone's well-being, like if they're using it like within a grocery store? So it wasn't necessarily focused on employment.
Okay. Okay.
I have one more question from Sri, but Derek, you had a question?
Yeah, I did have a question. Thank you, Mark, for your talk. One of the things I'm wondering about, a few things, but the one I was going to ask about was this idea of beneficence. And I'm wondering, what are some ways, or what are some more of your thoughts on how to ascertain who will benefit from a technology, especially when it's pretty far up the development stream? Like, how do you keep that question in mind? What are some things to be thinking about as we're thinking about beneficence?
Yeah, definitely. So I think, yeah, you have to identify the stakeholders that may be able to use the technology, and also what are some potential restrictions from them using those technologies. So things such as what keeps coming up again and again when I speak to farmers and also roboticists is that farmers don't want to be computer scientists. They want to be farmers, but they want to use these technologies in a very easy and efficient way. So you need to have the interface in a manner that the farmer can just basically go in and start using it straight away without having to, do computer science programming courses and so forth. And in terms of beneficence, another aspect would be accessibility. So how can you better ensure that everyone can use these technologies and use AI that want to use them? So what are other aspects that may prohibit or inhibit them from using these technologies? So will it be a cost thing? And then in regards to, if it's a cost thing, is it possible to make it open access? Is it possible to get some kind of subsidies so poorer farmers or people in the global south can benefit from the technology? If it's a thing about education levels, are there any types of courses, like very easy courses or education or training that can be implemented in order to better ensure that those who would like to use these technologies, who are unable to use these technologies, can be upskilled or shown how to? So these are just a few things that spring to mind.
Awesome. So I have one question that will perhaps segue into Sri's question here. So this notion, you talked about data ownership and privacy, right? So, but with these improving resolution of satellites and remote sensing, presumably you can imagine a day not too far away when you can have sub-meter resolution of every farmer's field every day over the growing season, right? So then, is there an expectation? I mean, there's no expectation of privacy, right? So can you talk a little bit about how do we navigate that?
So you're talking about if there's data retrieved about the farm, but you don't need to get the farmer's consent or permission in order to retrieve the data? Like
because you're 40 miles above the earth, right? And but you're still getting, you can read a you can read a license plate at the ground level with improving satellite resolution. So then you can do high resolution, high temporal resolution, high spatial resolution imaging of a field and get a lot of information out, right? So how do you bring in these ethical considerations in that context?
So first of all, I would probably ask, what type of information could this type of technology retrieve? So could it retrieve privacy infringing information to begin with? Or could it just, would it be non-privacy infringing information? So I think that's the burning question, rather than necessarily about retrieving data or retrieving like an image of the farm, just in and of itself.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
can you think of examples? Like, can you brainstorm like what you mean? Like, how could it be privacy infringing? Or
so perhaps a quick example here, and then let me think of a few more examples, and I will come back to you. Let me not hold the conversation. Is if certain management practices, farmers may not want to reveal what their practices are, but if you have continuous imaging of a farmer's field, you could potentially figure out what those practices are, right? So and that's where, I mean, the secret sauce, if you will, right? That's probably one thing that could be extracted. But chew on that, please. Let me chew on other brainstorming things. Shri, you had a question?
Yeah, so my question was actually on data ownership and privacy. And one of those things that that interests me in terms of understanding is that, do you find from all those literature that you went through any difference between large farmers and small farmers with respect to how they view data privacy and data ownership? And also if there is a cultural or geographical difference. And also the other question is based on what Bhaskar asked about satellites imagery. So one of the issues that may crop up is with the issue of water. Satellite imagery might reveal that there is certain deposits of water under a particular tract of land in a farmer's area. So that land then becomes highly coveted, price-wise, and the farmer may not want that information released. So that's a privacy, even though there is no direct access to who that farm belongs to, but at least from an overall perspective, you can figure out, or you can triangulate to see who that owner of that farm is, and that reveals a privacy issue. So that's more of a comment than the first question is more in terms of the privacy data ownership issue between large and small farms and culture versus geography. So if you could address that.
yeah, sure. So in relation to small or large farms, I didn't encounter any specific difference, but definitely within regional and cultural differences in the context of privacy and data ownership. Like within the EU, there's like huge concern around privacy and data ownership over the past few years because of the high publicity around the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. So everyone is aware of GDPR, like within the EU at the moment, and there's a lot of consternation and discussion around it. So we found, like, in relation to European farmers, for the most part, privacy and data protection was a hot topic. But interestingly enough, there was a few countries that were not in the EU that we discussed, such as Croatia, and they said that privacy and data protection isn't being discussed whatsoever within their government, and it's not really a major issue. And they hoped that it would become a more important theme. But even within Europe, there's divergences as well. Like, some countries cared about it more and others less. Like, for example, Germany and the Netherlands were a lot more concerned with privacy and data protection than countries in Eastern Europe.
Mark, this is Peter. I have a question and great discussion. So in your bullet point about privacy, there was no really about data ownership. And of course, a lot of discussion with farmers about who owns the data, right? And when farmers believe they own the data, they want to have some kind of implication about the price, the value of the data. That's one part. The other part, how that ownership of data is justified. Is it through like trademark, copyright? How is the European Union label what's behind what's behind of the data ownership piece? jurisdictional? Is it trademark, copyright, whatever? How you would assign this? Because I just cannot tell. If I'm high, I just cannot tell. It's my data, right? So what's the behind of the how you would justify the data ownership?
Data ownership, it did not come up in the 21 articles that I covered for AI ethics in agriculture, so it wasn't included in the slides, but in other research, yeah, data ownership is a hot topic amongst farmers. So I was working on another project in the context of agricultural data sharing, and it was one of the most common themes that kept arising over and over again, and it was one of the main concerns for farmers. I'm not 100% sure, if I'm being honest, about the exact nature of data ownership within the EU. There's constantly changing regulations that keep appearing, like every 6 months or 9 months. The latest is the Data Governance Act, just before Christmas. But that's more, yeah, it's more in relation to the context of how you can share data and distribute data for societal benefits and societal goods that may infringe upon the GDPR. But in the context of data ownership, your question is more in relation to what are current regulations in the context of data ownership in agriculture, is it?
Yeah.
I don't have a concrete answer of the ins and outs of it. Yeah, I would have to check that.
Thank you. Thanks.
But most organizations, like within Europe, like AI organizations, they say that yeah, ownership of the data is with the farmers. But like this is a very sort of, how would I say, misleading interpretation. So they mean essentially the raw data that they retrieve from the farmers. They don't mean once it's like manipulated and that they retrieve different aspects and benefits from it. So it's just the initial raw data that's retrieved from the farms. So I think that's where one of the main issues arises, and a lot of AI organizations within Europe, they say, yeah, it's fine if you want to change provider, we'll give you back your data, but they just, they give them back the raw data as opposed to the manipulated or beneficial data that they repurpose.
Okay, thank you.
We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions before we hit the there are no takers. I have perhaps a final question. Can you talk a little bit about the possibility of AI enabled agriculture being a value addition, in that when you have, we talked about this earlier, organic would be a value addition, right? So in some sense that consumers may be willing to pay more, right? Is there a way to market AI-enabled farming to maybe add a markup to products?
I don't know within a US context, but amongst the farmers and roboticists that I spoke to, they are just looking for like what's most beneficial for them. They don't really care what type of technologies or what type of methods are employed. So if AI can provide better solutions, if they can reduce fertilizer use, if they can increase crop yields, then it's a reason, but it needs to be a substantial increase. So if it's just like a minor increase, they'll probably won't even bother using or deploying them. So it's the end result really for farmers. That's just something that kept coming up over and over again, that they just want better technologies that are usable, that can be easily implemented, aren't going to cause too many problems, too many issues, will increase yields, increase economic earnings.
Excellent, thanks. With that, let's all thank Mark again. Mark, this is a phenomenal, very informative seminar. We learned a lot. We have a lot more questions that we'll probably follow up with. Thank you for allowing us to record this. We have a much larger group of people who would love to look at this and follow up with more questions. So thanks, Mark.
Okay, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice weekend.
You too.
You too.